Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the chaotic headlines you scroll past every morning, the soaring national debt, the cultural polarization, the erosion of the dollar's value, are not random, isolated misfortunes, but rather the precise, sequential milestones of a mathematical pattern that has destroyed every global superpower for the last 5 centuries? And ask yourself this: if you knew that the United States was not merely approaching a theoretical decline, but was already deep within the 5th stage of a fatal 7-stage sequence, would you still believe that this time is different? To understand why this is happening, we must first recognize that history is not merely a collection of dates and battles, but a repository of behavior patterns that repeat with terrifying consistency. When we study the rise and fall of great empires, we do not see a random scatterplot of events. Instead, we see a cycle. It is a cycle that has claimed the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union. In each instance, the collapse was not a matter of bad luck or a single catastrophic defeat. It was a systemic process, a specific sequence of economic and political decisions that led to inevitable ruin. Today, in 2025, the United States is not exempt from this history. We are walking the exact same path, decision by decision, almost as if we are reading from the same script that led our predecessors to catastrophe. The terrifying reality is that we have already completed 5 of the 7 stages of imperial collapse. We are not approaching the precipice. We are sliding down the slope. This essay is an examination of that pattern, how empires die, why they always convince themselves they are the exception, and why the math suggests we are next. Before we dissect the specific historical examples, we must correct a fundamental misconception about the mechanics of how superpowers actually die. When we think of the fall of an empire, our minds often drift to dramatic imagery, the sacking of Rome by Visigoths, the burning of cities, or total military annihilation. However, in the modern era, specifically the last 500 years, imperial collapse rarely begins with invasion. It begins with economic exhaustion. The death of a superpower is, at its core, a financial event. It happens when the empire extends beyond its ability to maintain itself. This overextension manifests in a web of obligations, military bases in hundreds of countries, wars fought on multiple fronts, social promises that cannot be funded, and debts that can never be repaid. This process invariably starts with an invisible decline that rapidly accelerates before anyone realizes the danger. Initially, the decline is invisible to the average citizen. The currency still functions at the grocery store. The military still wins tactical engagements. The government continues to issue bonds and make grand promises. But beneath this veneer of stability, the structural foundation is rotting. Resources are misallocated away from productive endeavors, like manufacturing and innovation, toward maintenance of the status quo and debt service. This leads to the acceleration phase. As the economic reality tightens, the most talented citizens, the engineers, the builders, the visionaries, begin to leave, seeking stability elsewhere. This brain drain is a critical leading indicator. Simultaneously, allies begin to hedge their bets, sensing weakness, while enemies begin to test boundaries that were previously sacrosanct. Finally, the empire reaches the tipping point. The very advantages that made it powerful, its ubiquity, its reserve currency status, its global reach, transform into lethal vulnerabilities. The currency, once demanded by the world, floods back home, triggering hyperinflation. The military, spread thin across the globe, becomes a liability rather than an asset. It is a transition from omnipotence to impotence, often happening much faster than anyone anticipates. To see this pattern in its original form, we need to look back at the first true global superpower, the Spanish Empire of the 16th century. Following Columbus's voyage in 1492, Spain became the master of the world. They controlled half the known globe, and crucially, they controlled the money. The conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires gave Spain access to the richest gold and silver mines ever discovered. By the year 1600, Spanish galleons were transporting over 400 tons of silver annually back to Europe. The Spanish real was the global reserve currency, accepted from Manila to Mexico City. Spain appeared invincible, yet they were the first to demonstrate the fatal pattern. It began, as it always does, with the seductive trap of military overextension. King Philip II, who ruled during the empire's peak, fell into the classic trap of the superpower, the belief that he could police the world. Spain fought wars on every conceivable front. They battled the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, the French in Italy, Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, and the English at sea. By 1580, Spain had military commitments on 4 continents. The cost was staggering, consuming over half of the empire's total revenue. Yet, rather than retracting, they expanded, believing their infinite supply of silver would cover the check. But military ambition quickly led to the 2nd and 3rd stages of the pattern: currency debasement and a spiral of unpayable debt. Even with all the silver in the Americas, the Spanish crown could not pay its bills. So they did what every failing empire eventually does. They debased the currency. They began mixing copper into the silver coins. A coin that was once pure silver became 50% copper, then 75%. While the face value remained the same, the real value plummeted. Merchants stopped accepting them and inflation exploded. Simultaneously, Spain entered a death spiral of debt. They borrowed heavily from Italian and German bankers to fund their wars. The result? Spain, the richest empire in history, declared bankruptcy in 1557, then again in 1560, then 1575, then 1596, 4 bankruptcies in 40 years. The final blow to Spain was not financial, but the total loss of productive capacity and the resulting social decay. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Spain's fall was this loss of capacity. Because they had free money flowing from the mines, the Spanish nobility considered work beneath them. Why build ships or grow food when you can just buy them from the Dutch or the English? Spain became a hollow conduit. The wealth flowed in from the Americas and immediately flowed out to pay other nations for goods. Domestic manufacturing withered. As the economy rotted, society decayed. Crime in Madrid exploded. The productive middle class emigrated to France and England, countries that were actually building things. Spain was left with a population of bureaucrats, soldiers, and priests. By 1650, they had lost the Netherlands and Portugal. By 1700, the Spanish Empire was a shell. They went from the master of the world to a second-rate power in less than a century, a status from which they arguably never fully recovered as a global hegemon. Fast forward 300 years, and we see the exact same tragedy replay with the British Empire in the 20th century. In 1914, Britain was the undisputed master of the globe. The sun never set on its territory, which covered 25% of the Earth's land surface. The pound sterling was the rock of the global financial system. London was the center of the world. Like Spain, Britain eventually found that the cost of victory was more than the empire could bear. Britain suffered from severe military overextension. They had to defend India, vast swaths of Africa, holdings in the Middle East, and territories in the Pacific. When World War I erupted, Britain chose to fight to maintain the global order. The cost was $40 billion, $1 trillion in today's money. To finance this, they borrowed heavily from the rising power of the United States. By the end of the war, the creditor had become the debtor. This led directly to currency debasement. Britain's gold reserves were drained. In a desperate attempt to project strength, they returned to the gold standard in 1925 at pre-war rates. It was a fatal error. The pound was overvalued, crushing British exports and destroying the domestic manufacturing base. In 1931, reality won. Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound lost 25% of its value overnight. World War II drove the final nail in the coffin, leading to the swift end of the empire. The war cost another $120 billion. By 1945, Britain owed the US and Canada an amount larger than its entire GDP. The empire was technically victorious, but economically dead. The loss of empire was swift. In 1947, unable to afford the cost of occupation, Britain gave up India, the jewel of the crown. Over the next 2 decades, the rest followed. Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean. By 1970, the empire was a memory. The currency collapse continued relentlessly. In 1940, 1 pound bought $4.03. Today, it buys roughly $1.20. Britain transitioned from the ruler of the waves to a museum of past greatness, holding a permanent seat on the UN Security Council as a nostalgic nod to a power that no longer exists. The most recent example, and perhaps the most alarming due to the speed of its collapse, is the Soviet Union. Emerging from WTWIC as a nuclear superpower, the USSR spent 45 years competing for global dominance. They had more tanks, more missiles, and more men than the United States. The Soviets became a hollow giant, obsessed with military strength while their economic engine withered. They were obsessed with military overextension, spending between 15% and 20% of their GDP on the military, triple what the US spent. They propped up communist regimes in Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, and Ethiopia, all while fighting a disastrous war in Afghanistan. But their economic engine was broken. Central planning stifled innovation. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy had stopped growing. Despite having some of the most fertile farmland on Earth in Ukraine and Russia, the USSR had to import grain to feed its people because their agricultural system was so inefficient. This economic hollowness led to a sudden, brutal implosion that shocked the world. The currency was a sham. The ruble had no value outside the Iron Curtain. The regime survived on oil exports. When oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, the game was over. They lost their empire in the blink of an eye. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and the satellite states of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, broke away. Then came the complete collapse. It is haunting to remember that in 1990, experts still predicted the USSR would last for decades. On December 26, 1991, it ceased to exist. It took only 900 days from the fall of the wall to the total dissolution of the state. A superpower with 30,000 nuclear weapons did not die in battle. It died because it ran out of money. This brings us to the present moment and the terrifying realization that the United States is living through this exact same sequence. We have systematically checked off the first 5 stages of the collapse pattern. First, we must acknowledge that our military reach has exceeded our grasp. The United States maintains over 750 military bases in 80 countries. We have active duty troops in 150 nations. Our military budget is $850 billion a year, exceeding the next 10 nations combined. Yet, reports consistently show that we are stretched too thin. We are attempting to counter Russia in Europe, China in the Pacific, and Iran in the Middle East simultaneously. Our equipment is aging, recruitment is at historic lows, and our strategic goals far exceed our resource availability. We are Spain in 1580, we are Britain in 1914. Second, we have engaged in the systematic debasement of our currency. In 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window, ending the direct convertibility of the US dollar to gold. Since then, the dollar has been a pure fiat currency. The abuse of this privilege has been staggering. Since the year 2000, the US money supply has increased by 400%. Since 2020 alone, we have printed over $6 trillion. The result is that the dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1971. We are not shaving silver off coins like the Spanish. We are printing digits on a screen. The mechanism is different, but the result, debasement, is identical. Third, we have entered a debt spiral from which there is no easy escape. The United States national debt stands at $36 trillion, which is 120% of our GDP. But the raw number is less frightening than the trajectory. Interest payments on this debt are approaching $1 trillion per year. We are now spending more on servicing our past debt than we spend on our national defense. We are borrowing money just to pay the interest on the money we already borrowed. This is the textbook definition of a debt spiral. There is no mathematical path to paying this off. The only options are default or hyperinflation. Fourth, like the empires before us, we have gutted our own productive capacity. Like Spain before us, America has ceased to be a nation of producers. We design, we finance, and we consume, but we do not make. We have gutted our manufacturing base, shipping it to China, Mexico, and Vietnam in search of cheaper margins. We run an annual trade deficit of $800 billion. We are dependent on foreign adversaries for our medicine, our electronics, our steel, and even the components of our weapon systems. We have become a financial conduit, not a physical powerhouse. And finally, we are witnessing the 5th stage, the decay of our social fabric. We see the rot in our society. Trust in public institutions, Congress, the media, the medical establishment is at all-time lows. We are witnessing an explosion of deaths of despair. Drug overdoses killing 100,000 Americans annually, rising suicide rates, and a homelessness crisis in our major cities. The social fabric is tearing. Political dysfunction has paralyzed the government. We cannot agree on basic facts, let alone solutions. The brain drain is internal as the most productive citizens check out of the system, disheartened by a meritocracy that no longer seems to function. I want to pause here and ask you, do you see these signs in your own community? The rising prices, the social friction, the feeling that something is fundamentally broken? I would love to hear your perspective in the comments below on which stage you think impacts your daily life the most right now, or if you believe there's still time to turn things around. If the pattern holds, and 500 years of history suggests it will, we must prepare for the final stages. The next milestone is the loss of reserve currency status. This is the moment the world decides it no longer wants to hold the failing superpowers' IOUs. We are seeing the early tremors of this earthquake. The BRICS nations are actively developing alternative payment systems. Central banks around the world are buying gold at the fastest pace in history, dumping dollars to do so. Countries like Saudi Arabia are beginning to accept Chinese yuan for oil. When the dollar loses its status, the exorbitant privilege of printing money to pay our bills vanishes. The trillions of dollars held overseas will flood back into the U.S. economy, triggering an inflationary event that will make 2022 look like a period of stability. Following this is the final stage, collapse. History teaches us that the end is rarely a slow, graceful decline. It is a sudden implosion. The Soviet Union went from a global superpower to non-existence in less than 3 years. Britain lost its empire in a single generation. When the money stops working, the system stops working. A currency crisis triggers a sovereign debt crisis, which triggers a political legitimacy crisis. In this vacuum, the superpower status evaporates overnight, leaving behind a regional power struggling with internal chaos. However, to fully grasp the gravity of our position, we must look beyond the economic charts and understand the psychological and structural traps that make reversal nearly impossible. The first barrier is the phenomenon known as normalcy bias. This is the psychological state that comforts a citizenry living in the twilight of an empire. We look around at our Starbucks, our iPhones, and our streaming services, and our brains struggle to compute that this continuity of comfort could end. The citizens of Rome in 400 AD, or Spain in 1590, or London in 1913 suffered from the exact same delusion. They believed their civilizations were eternal because they had never known anything else. This bias blinds leadership and the populace alike, treating warnings of collapse as doomsday fantasies rather than mathematical probabilities. We convince ourselves that systems will save us, forgetting that systems are fragile constructs of confidence that evaporate the moment trust is lost. Compounding this psychological paralysis is the mathematical checkmate facing our central planners, a situation often referred to as the sovereign debt trap. The Federal Reserve and the U.S. government are currently trapped in a dilemma with no exit. To fight inflation, they must raise interest rates. But raising rates on $36 trillion of debt makes the interest payments unaffordable, potentially bankrupting the government. Conversely, to keep the government solvent, they must lower rates and print money to pay the debt. But doing so reignites hyperinflation, destroying the currency and the middle class. This is the checkmate. There is no third option. History shows that when faced with the choice between immediate government bankruptcy, austerity, and destroying the currency, inflation, politicians choose inflation 100% of the time. It is the path of least resistance, pushing the pain into the future until the currency eventually collapses entirely. We are not waiting for a crisis. The policy decisions that guarantee the crisis have already been made. Finally, we must recognize that the timeline of collapse is compressing due to the acceleration factor of the digital age. In the 1600s, it took months for news of a Spanish default to travel across the empire. In the 1930s, bank runs in Britain happened at the speed of a physical queue. Today, panic moves at the speed of light. We saw a preview of this with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank in 2023, where $42 billion was withdrawn in a single day via smartphone apps. The next crisis will not unfold over years or decades like the decline of Spain. It will happen in hours. When the global market loses faith in the US dollar or US Treasury bonds, the sell-off will be algorithmic, instantaneous, and brutal. The digital infrastructure that we pride ourselves on will serve as the superhighway for our own demise, facilitating a capital flight so rapid that regulators will be powerless to stop it. We are building the machinery of our own destruction, assuming it will only ever be used for our convenience. If this analysis is providing value to you and helping you see the signal through the noise, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us bypass the algorithm to get this crucial historical context to more people before it is too late. In conclusion, we must face the uncomfortable truth that American exceptionalism will not save us from economic reality. The tragedy of this cycle is not just that it happens, but that every empire convinces itself that it is immune. We tell ourselves, we are America, we have Silicon Valley. We have the Marines, we are different. Spain thought they were different because they had God and silver. Britain thought they were different because they had the Navy and the banks. The Soviets thought they were different because they had ideology and nuclear weapons. They were all wrong. The pattern is mathematical. You cannot spend more than you make forever. You cannot print wealth out of thin air without consequences. You cannot maintain a global empire without a domestic productive base. The laws of economics are as immutable as the laws of physics. Since 2020, we have not pulled back from the brink. We have pressed the accelerator. We have printed more, borrowed more, and divided ourselves more deeply. The sequence is locked in. The only variable remaining is time. Maybe we have a decade, maybe we have 5 years, or maybe, like the Soviets, we are days away from a catalyst we cannot yet see. But make no mistake, the script has been written. The actors have taken their places. And unless we manage to achieve the impossible, a total systemic reform that reverses decades of momentum, we are about to learn the same lesson that Spain, Britain, and the USSR learned before us. The sun sets on every empire, and the shadows are getting long.